others, prisoners for instance, or persons with disabilities, women sometimes, children, indigenous peoples. And when we go through some of the norms of the new treaty, you'll see that this treaty, this Prohibition Treaty of last year, also mentioned several categories of particular vulnerable groups. So this is really this link to the human rights branch this new treaty makes. And extraterritorial application of human rights treaties, and this is also an advantage, I would say. It's not so clear which state would be responsible for assisting the victims and for violating human rights. If state A uses a nuclear weapon, I hope never happened, state A would use a nuclear weapon against state B, and we would have a European Court of Human Rights. Would this be on the jurisdiction of state A or state B? How much a court would have been could involve himself in these questions? So it's not always so easy to find the link between an actual act, which happens not on its own territory but somewhere else. So these are tricky questions, but I think the basis is that some acts can deploy fact or effects abroad even. So after having explained these points which speak in favor of human rights compared to international humanitarian law, for instance, I also now draw a list of the most important rights, from my point of view, most important rights which are could be affected in attack of by nuclear weapons. Right to life, of course, is one of the most important one. Talk about civil rights, prohibition of degrading and inhuman treatment, including torture. At least degrading and inhuman treatment is important, I think. So this picture of Nagasaki and Hiroshima before, I think it's clear that the use of nuclear weapons is really about the dignity of human being, and this is exactly protected by the prohibition of degrading and inhuman treatment under Article 3, for instance, of the European Convention on Human Rights. Right to respect for private life and home, and right to property. I write about this in the book. Of course, we have seen destruction in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. These are obviously rights which would be completely violated by the use of nuclear weapons, as they have been violated by testing of nuclear weapons already. And then we have the duty to respect human rights after nuclear explosion. This would be another positive obligation, flowing, for instance, from the right to life. So there's not only obligation not to violate human rights, but if something happens, like an environmental catastrophe, then the state has to assist the victims. And this can be, of course, also applied to the use of nuclear weapons. I have 5 more minutes on the book, and maybe 5 more minutes for. Is it okay? You are quite flexible, yeah? If the others are not too much bored, and then maybe we can talk a bit about certain aspects a bit more in detail. So, due to respect human rights after nuclear explosion, or like after a war or during a war, there, under the European Convention of Human Rights, there's an obligation to try to find missing persons, for instance. This would be, of course, exactly the same in the case of nuclear weapons attack. It would be very difficult to identify the people, the victims, the injured people, and to assist them, because basically the whole infrastructure, medical infrastructure, would be completely destroyed. These are things which are aspects which have been studied in the 3 humanitarian impact conferences which I mentioned before. It would be basically impossible to assist victims after a nuclear attack happened. A bit of economic, social, and cultural rights. These are sometimes rights which are a bit neglected among lawyers. That's many, unfortunate. But I studied them well, included them into my book. And I think it makes really a lot of sense in the field of nuclear weapons. Because here again, studies show, have revealed the big, considerable impact of regional nuclear war on global development, health and environment, so-called nuclear winter. So I quoted a study in my book on which takes Indian, Pakistani nuclear war as an example. Each of these two states, India and Pakistan, both nuclear weapon states, uses 50 quite small nuclear weapons, Nagasaki, Hiroshima type of yield weapons, 100 altogether, and these 100 detonations would lead to what sometimes called nuclear winter, because a lot of cities would burn and the soot produced by the explosions and by the burning infrastructure would completely cover or would hinder the sun arriving at the Earth, basically, on the surface of the Earth, and would lead to a drop in temperature, nuclear winter, and of course this would lead to a shortage of food, shortage of production, agricultural production, seasons of production would be shorter. These are things which have been studied quite in detail. It's quite surprising. And so there would be more poverty. The already poor people would become even more rural, would die. There would be a mass migration, of course, of this region. So these 100 detonations would lead to roughly 20 million victims, and another 20 millions would flee, would leave this region. So there's really interesting studies on the global impact of quite limited nuclear war between two nuclear weapon states. Only 0.03% of the arsenal used, and still so much damage would be done on a global scale. And it's quite easy once I consider these studies, quite easy actually to find how much this would be influencing the enjoyment of these economic, social and cultural rights. Rights to higher standards of health and to a healthy environment, rights to 90% of living, in particular the right to food and to water. And these rights are also in the UN backed up by committees. And these committees sometimes have issued general comments on those rights, and where you find sometimes references to nuclear issues, nuclear weapons issues. So I'm not the first one who brings up this the impact of such use of nuclear weapons on those rights either. Right to water, this is also something which is quite new. But just to tell you that in the nuclear weapons test at the US in the desert of Nevada between the 50s and the 90s, 6 trillion liters of groundwater have been poisoned. 6 trillion liters of groundwater have been poisoned in the desert of Nevada, of course, a region which is already lacking clean water. Human rights of particularly vulnerable groups is also something which I focus in my book. This recent trend, as I mentioned, to place certain people which are more vulnerable than others at the forefront of the protection of human rights, or here in the arms control debate, children's rights, women's rights, indigenous peoples' rights. I don't have the time to go too much into the details, but it is proven in the Semi-Paladinsk region, for instance, or Chernobyl regions, or nuclear testing, or nuclear accidents in Fukushima as well, or Chernobyl. That it's always the children and the women who are suffering more than the others. And at indigenous peoples, for instance, there are studies, UN studies, done in the Marshall Islands, which have been the place of a terrible US nuclear testing during decades, and where people suffered a lot and have been displaced sometimes to protect them, but indigenous peoples without their traditionally owned land they can't survive, or they are not the same anymore. Something which has been nicely described by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, not on nuclear issues of course, but I draw the parallel. How much more indigenous peoples would suffer from nuclear testing, they did actually, or would suffer from the use of nuclear weapons, because they are tied to their lands, and this is nicely from my point of view said. For instance, in this passage, in the case of Kakmok Kasek Indigenous Community versus Paraguay, the culture of the members of the indigenous communities corresponds to a specific way of life, of being, seeing and acting in a world constituted on the basis of their close relationship, here we are, with their traditional lands and natural resources, not only because these are their main means of substance, but also because they are an integral